Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Just apologies for a couple of technical glitches there. As I was saying, managing old technologies like parchment turns out to be a heck of a lot easier than new technologies. This whole Zoom thing, you'd think I'd understand it by now. So it is great to have everybody in front of us here and a bunch of folks online as well. And to welcome Alexis Hagadorn from Columbia University. I'll tell you a little more about her in just a minute. But first, I will try to speak into the camera. But first I will say, so people in the room can see already that we have I hope you will agree, an impressive spread of animal-like materials, parchment on the table. So if you haven't already looked at those, we'll make sure to save time to do that. For you folks online, that's the way it goes. There are pluses and minuses. But I did want to just begin by saying that I love parchment. It's really neat stuff, and I think those of us who work here will probably agree it's kind of the most impressive material substrate that we've got around. There's a kind of a wonderful illusion to parchment. It appears when people see it for the first time to be the most fragile, the most unstable, the most delicate, the most scary, oh my God, of materials. It's definitely the one that students are always the most afraid to touch. And yet, as some of you know, and I'm sure Alexis will tell us more about that, it's one of the most durable substances around, one of the best data storage formats for preserving our cultural messages that we've ever come up with as a species, perhaps, right up there with, stone carving and cave painting. Perhaps the Internet Archive should begin investing in parchment backup solutions. I will tell one brief anecdote. I'm not sure he's online or not, but I remember very well our senior colleague, Dan Traster, joking with groups of students when holding a book with an early vellum binding, like there are some examples of on the table. Dan would joke that you could put this out on Walnut Street and let a truck run over it, and it would be okay. I do not think that even Dan Traster actually tried this experiment. Apologies to you conservators listening in, but he made his point. Our parchment collections have actually taken on some exciting new meanings as we begin to recover the animal lives that lie behind them, so to speak, and investigate what our friends have been calling the biology of the book. So that is a whole new way in which our parchment, you could say, is coming back to life. And I think we will hear a lot more about those new lives and things that we can learn from Alexis this evening. This is meant as a very hands-on session, as much as we can make it. Again, apologies, Zoomers. I have some samples here, and I believe Alexis has some others that can go around. These are modern parchments, but very effective at communicating what parchment is. And as I said before, there's plenty of material on the table. Let me now, though, tell you a little more about Alexis. Alexis is the head of conservation at Columbia University, the Columbia University Libraries, where she's worked since 1997 as a rare books and special collections conservator. That's a good long stretch of time. She began her research on parchment at Columbia in the library services program for conservators, and she's worked as a conservator and studied conservation at Trinity College Dublin and at Yale University. She's also on the visiting faculty at the Mellon Library and Archive program at the in the Conservation Center of the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, and the Pratt School of Information. Alexis has a long and impressive CV, which I won't read to you, except to say that what I really admire about this is her ability to be both clearly the most active working of conservators and a highly involved and dedicated teacher and communicator about those practices. That's not an easy balance. But it's one of the reasons we invited her here today, because we think our seminar needs to learn about what you know. So without further ado, I'm turning it over to Alexis. Her title tonight is Reading Medieval Parchment Through an 18th Century Lens. Thank you.
All right, so it's probably well known to the attendees in this distinguished audience, but I always do start a talk about parchment explaining what it is, because occasionally there is someone who doesn't know, and that's really understandable. We don't have a lot of parchment around that we're working with all the time these days. So the term parchment refers to an animal skin that has been unhaired and dried under tension. And in this way, it's different from leather, which has been unhaired, but then treated with tanning agents and has gone through other processes. And the real difference in those two factors, other than the qualities and characteristics, is that it's a product that's imputrescible in water. If you get leather wet, it still is leather. It's been chemically changed into something else. And that's very different from parchment, which hasn't really been changed. It's been reshaped and dried, but could get wet and kind of go back to where it started from in some ways, could certainly putrefy if it gets wet, which is, you know, as long as it lasts a long time, as long as it's dry, let's say. So in the image that I decided to put on the title slide, this figure is always identified as Saint Jerome on the right, who's acquiring parchment from a parchment maker. And so it's showing some features that you would associate with a parchment maker. The parchment maker is holding a rolled piece of parchment under their arm and handing off a squared piece for sale. And behind the two figures is a wooden frame that's showing the animal skin being tensioned. If I can do it with my cursor, you can see it here. And then this blue shape is the lunar knife, which is used to scrape the surface of the parchment to prepare it for writing. It also is used for some shaving when the parchment is wet, a similar knife, and it has a wooden handle that is sort of perpendicular to the blade. So parchment's been used for diverse purposes, such as furniture and clothing and musical instruments, but it's probably most associated with its use as a support for writing and printing. And it was the primary writing support of the medieval period in Europe and the Middle East, and continued to be used in the modern period for legal documents. And in fact, so modern that until 2015, record copies of every public act in the United Kingdom were printed on parchment until the law was changed requiring that. As the primary writing support of the medieval period, when we look at medieval books and documents and book bindings, we do see a very diverse array of characteristics, including different colors and opacities, different amounts of flexibility and thickness in the skin, and an absence or presence of holes and spots and other markings. And the selection that has been brought out so kindly today will show this to us after we're done talking. But at the same time, there's very little recorded information that explains the detail about how parchment makers carried out their work. There's often a brief description that you might see in a treatise that explains the very basic steps, but not how fine variations were created. So Ronald Reed, who's a well-known leather historian and wrote about parchment extensively, said, "Parchment only too well exemplifies how a wealth of technical knowledge acquired carefully over many centuries may easily become neglected and lost." And this was the inspiration for my delving into the treatises of the 18th century, where there were attempts made to record actual practices. And I'll talk more about that in a bit, but this was especially true in France, and there is a lot of detail. So more than 10 years ago, I began a review of the 18th century treatises on parchment making and leather working, still ongoing in various ways. And the first part of this was published in the Journal of the Institute of Conservation. And this consisted of a review of the techniques that are recounted in several works, comparing them to relevant historical trends to determine what these texts as a group can contribute to our knowledge of 18th century French practices. For my talk this evening, I'm just going to give some very brief details of that study and spend more time looking at specific examples of evidence of manufacturing steps that were documented in this later modern period that can serve to explain possibly some of the evidence that we can see in the medieval period. So I'll briefly describe basic steps in manufacture, and then I'll discuss where this documentation resides and what can be discerned from it. Then I'll look at how we can interpret the treatises based on a knowledge of the material. If we understand something about what we're seeing and we understand the craft practices, we can bring that to bear on the treatises, which may or may not be accurate, and that's for us to determine. And then I'm going to next look at how, by reading what's in the treatises, to the extent that we can trust it, we can understand the material better and how it was created. So I hope that's not too much to do in a short time. So I'm showing you first an image from Lalande's Art de faire le parchemin from 1762. And that work is a long monograph, and it contains 2 different plates. And this is a detail of plate 1, which he explains, although it says parchment maker at the top, he's actually showing the practices of the Alamtar's or Wittayer's studio, where the skin production to make parchment actually began in France. So there's a sort of division that is probably more particular to France or specific to France in some ways. So some of these steps are when the skins are received, to soak them and wash them. They've usually been dried or salted first. Because they're mostly sheepskins that were being used in France, they're removing the wool to use for a bunch of different processes. They're painting lime directly onto the skin to help make the residual hair come out, putting it over a beam, and I'll look at this more in a minute, and working the beam with a rounded knife that fits the shape of the beam, both to push out material that's made up into the part of the skin that's going to be retained, but then also to cut off remnants of tissue on the underside of the skin and to push off the hair. So that's an important process. And then finally, letter E, putting the parchment in the lime vat. So the steps of fleshing and unhairing are really critical, because when the skin comes off the animal, there are remnants of the tissue that's toward the animal, and it's in a very swollen, wet state. And the water in the skin is mixing with materials that are interwoven between the fibers, the collagen fibers of the skin. And leather workers are trying to push that out. If you think of rawhide, if you've ever worked with rawhide as a material, that's a material where that gluey substance that's in the skin hasn't been removed. So to the extent that you can remove it, you're going to have a really flexible and supple skin. To the extent that it's left behind, you're going to have a hard and gluey skin. And then the process of scudding happens with a dull knife. So this is critical because you're working with a blade, and if the blade penetrates the dermal layer, anywhere that it's cut into it, when you stretch the skin to tension it, may open up as a hole. And so this is from Lalande again, his plate 2, looking at that process of tensioning the skin on the frame, then preparing the dried skin for writing through pouncing, either putting chalk and other sort of drying elements on it, or mild abrasives to form the surface to be a good writing surface, and then squaring it up for sale. So either sold as sheets cut to particular sizes or folded into booklets or flyers. And very briefly, I'm just going to look at the structure of the hide. So what's coming off in the scudding process is this epidermis and hair. This is the part the leather workers want underneath, the dermis or the corium. There's a grain layer, which we would call the hair side or the grain side of the finished skin. And then there's the flesh side, the part that was toward the animal. And just some details of different tensioning, either on a hoop frame or square frames, both were done. So it's a wet skin being stretched and dried in 2 dimensions. So I'm going to turn my attention to how this information is conveyed in the 18th century treatises. I looked at quite a lot of treatises, and I'm just going to focus on the ones that I think are the most major. But in this comparison, it became clear what's typical of this kind of knowledge transmission in a lot of different periods of history that we could look at, where there's some original text or group of texts that get copied and passed along. Errors might be introduced. People are copying information that they don't actually understand because it's part of some other compendium of knowledge. So the use of copied text can be very potentially confusing if you're trying to understand what's actual valid information. If the text was copied over and over again, it could indicate that outdated information was still current at the time that a particular treatise was published, or it could indicate perhaps consensus on a point by multiple authors when really just one text was involved, and that was certainly the fact with some of these. So I concentrated on 5 main treatises, but of these 3 were the most significant as 3 most original and influential works describing French practices. And this outline that's on the screen right now shows their relationship to other published works. And this was important. As a conservator, I'm reading a lot of literature that people are developing when they're looking at historic material. And I found that in particular in the English-speaking world, people tend to quote Vallancey's Art of Tanning, which is at the bottom of my slide, without being aware that it's actually an abridged translation of Lalande. So it's from a later date, and it's really copying segments of that text, not even the entire Art du Tanner written by Lalande. And the relationship between Chambers' Cyclopedia and Savary de Brouillan is another aspect that I looked at, where really what's in the Cyclopedia is a copy of what Savary de Brouillan wrote about parchment. But it's worth noting that Diderot's Encyclopédie also began as a French translation of Chambers' work. So there's sort of a cyclical process going on. Lalande was writing on behalf of the Académie Royale des Sciences in a series called Description des Arts et Métiers, which was begun in the 1690s but not completed. And its revival later was partly in response to the appearance of the Encyclopédie, because some members of the Académie felt that Diderot and d'Alembert's work didn't successfully satisfy both amateur and specialist interests. And when this project was revived, Lalande, who is actually an astronomer, undertook the writing of several topics, including those related to leather and paper making. And an aspect that I didn't really pursue in my earlier publication, that I'll only look at briefly here, it wasn't a focus of my study, was that there were claims of piracy made toward the Encyclopédie plates by the creators of the Description des Arts et Métiers. And so it'll be interesting to look at some of that evidence and consider how it might bear or not on this topic. So in relying on these texts for descriptions of parchment making techniques, it's important also to acknowledge that the authors themselves faced limitations. They weren't practitioners, but they were scientists and other educated people who were trying to document industrial arts for a higher purpose. They wanted to preserve this knowledge. And Lalande wrote about the challenges he faced with the craftsman's reluctance to share trade secrets. And this was frustrating because, as he asserted, these technical innovations were actually a treasure that should be held in common by all the peoples of the world, he wrote in his preface to Art du Tanner. And then we have an account by Diderot of his frustration. Anyone writing an article on the mechanical arts will learn, after having gone for some time from workshop to workshop with cash in his hand, and after having paid dearly for the most preposterous misinformation, what sort of people craftsmen are, especially those at Paris, on and on. So he understood that he wasn't necessarily getting the right story, but these were the ways that this information was being documented, that the practitioners were going to show what they pleased, and the observers would be limited in what they were shown. So I'm going to look very briefly at how interpreting the treatises with some information about the material itself and aspects of craft practice can give us information that may be lacking to us otherwise. And in my earlier study, I did look at some of the evidence around the process of unhairing with lime, and how when this was being translated, people who didn't understand thought mistook what was being said and repeated these errors. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm just going to look at the plagiarism question because it allows us to look at the plates and consider these topics a little bit. So I mentioned that there were these claims of plagiarism or piracy against the encyclopédie's plates. And you can see this comparison with Lalande's plate 1 of the parchment works and the encyclopédie. And this is something that was investigated in much more depth in a study in 1952 by George Watts that appears in the Paris Review. It's not really a subject of my study, but I did notice that he actually pulls out the parchment maker's plates as his one example of something like, you know, if you just look at this, you'll see the evidence, some evidence that was maybe ignored in the decision in favor of the encyclopédie in their legal cases. So looking at these details, we have 2 different representations of workshops, and that's not necessarily unique to the Arts et Métiers series either. That is something that has been a strategy that's been used in other treatises. But what he pointed to in George Watts' study was the similarity between these figures doing the washing and the lime vat as well. So we can see some comparisons there. But it's interesting also, having read both of these texts, and for people who might not be familiar with the encyclopédie, the entries for the encyclopédie appeared quite a bit earlier than the plates. And so it's interesting to note, whereas Lalande's work was all one continuous campaign, but it's interesting to note this piece of shrunken parchment that's been damaged by the fire. And where this is, so Lalande specifically describes this as a piece of parchment pulled from the fire at the Chambre des Comptes, or the Exchequer, which suffered a particular hardening. And the Chambre des Comptes suffered this horrific fire in 1737, which destroyed a lot of the building and a lot of the archive. And in Lalande's text description, there is probably a page about this piece of shrunken parchment. Whereas in the encyclopédie, this description does not appear anywhere in the text. There's only the mention of it in the captions to the plates. And the caption says, piece of parchment with writing, of which one side has shrunken from the heat of a fire, demonstrating that this element causes the fibers to draw closer together. So it's an exact replica of that same piece of burned parchment, but without the same understanding on the part of the person who was creating the plates. And then I'll turn now to this other object, which is the hearse. And on the plate of the Magicier or Tailleur, it's a wet piece of parchment that's being tensioned on the frame. And to look at why I would know that or assert that, we can just look at some evidence from manuscripts. And on the left, you're seeing a hole. So remember, if the dermis or the corium is nicked by a blade or cut into, it can open up into a hole. And we'll see some great examples from the collection here, where if the parchment maker stitches that hole together while the skin is still wet, you can draw the 2 edges back together and save a lot of the skin. And on the left, if you notice the edges of this opening where it's been stitched together, you can see that the edges sort of are festooned, the skin has pulled and then dried in this formation. And with more detail, it may not be obvious from a distance, it's sort of rolled over and gelatinized. And that's a sign that the skin was wet when this happened. Whereas on the right, this straight cut is 2 flat edges. This is parchment that's been cut later and been torn and stitched together after it was dry. So it's just to look at this, to think about what we see when we're looking at parchment that's being pulled and tensioned while it's wet. It can even pull through holes like that when it's wet. So Lalande's captions from his two different plates show on the left the skin that has been skewered and mounted upon the hearse to be shaved and then dried in the shade. So this is a wet skin and it's being stretched and tensioned. Whereas on the right, we're seeing something different. It says summer mounted on the scraping hearse. And the summer or sommier is a support. And so an older dried skin, maybe a poor quality one or one that has hair on it that's a little bit of a cushion, is tensioned onto the scraping frame, the scraping hearse. And that's the one the parchment maker is using to finish the dried parchment with a knife to prepare it for writing, to do the final finishing. And by having this springy summer on the back rather than a hard surface like a board, it prevents the round knife from cutting into the skin. It has a little bit of give so that when you're scraping it, you don't cut through it and you can work it quite hard. So this is actually part of the hearse now. And this clamp is used to put the new piece of skin that you're going to surface or work on. That's what's being shown. So when we go to the encyclopédie, representations of the same thing, I've got the two captions here in French, so you can see that the one on the left is a hearse mounted with skewers, and the one on the right is another hearse mounted differently. So it's missing some of the real understanding of what this item is. And it's not to discount the plates of the encyclopédie, which are longer and actually show more detail and more information. They're wonderful resources, but it's whoever was writing the captions certainly didn't understand what they were looking at. And I think that that is relevant information if you're trying to judge the process and how the information was being passed along. Sorry, I keep trying to advance with the arrows. There we go. So finally, I'm going to turn and look at the practice of interpreting the material by looking at what the text can tell us. And there are a couple of specific areas, looking at how to patch those holes that were created, aspects of surface treatment. We can't get into all the detail right now, and the question of fetal parchment or uterine vellum that comes up sometimes. So we'll have some good examples of this actually on the table, but I'm showing you an image from our Ashkenazic Mazur of the 14th century, which has a lot of holes like this, which you can see Basara Rastonis, the former Mellon conservator at Columbia, did a treatment of this where she had to add in thread that had been lost, the original thread that actually was needed. But there are a lot of other flay holes or holes from the parchment maker that where the thread obviously gave out while it was on the hearse and it kind of stretched and opened. And so those go throughout. You can see another one over here. And I hope that the audience will forgive me the great impertinence of reading a quote in French when I'm not a native speaker, but it actually works a little better this way. So Lalande writes about the process where the workers are doing this step of fleshing that you see illustrated on the right, and how difficult it was. I'll give you the English. Il est aisé avec le fer à écharner de faire des trousses aux pattes de devant quand on n'est pas attentif. Les ouvriers appellent cela faire un à cause de l'exclamation ordinaire de celui qui voit sa faute. And that's just a great example of the level of detail, the richness of these texts being recorded by a very astute observer who is really focused on getting all of the information and relating it. I love this, the works of Lalande on this subject. So you see that this was a problem that came up frequently. And the treatises of the 18th century, actually, I haven't found a mention of stitching, which is kind of curious. These are some of the representations from the encyclopédie, where it's showing skin that has flay holes or where the holes have opened on the hearse, knife marks, a bowl of gum, which actually appears in the Lalande plates as well, but also a bowl of little patches and shapes of the various patches. And although I'm showing you the encyclopédie, I'm going to describe what Lalande says about this, because there isn't actually a mention of how this was done in Diderot. but he talks about that it was easy to repair the holes by applying another patch over them. And these would be cut to be slightly larger than the hole they cover, and they would be scraped all over with a sharp knife to thin the edges. Then the skin is placed on a slab of marble, and gum arabic is used around the opening. The patch is applied to the hole, and it is rubbed around the edges with a small iron hammer. Sometimes one taps it with light blows to better unite it with the parchment. It is allowed to dry, and the hole is successfully filled. So here's an example. And this is not medieval, but a slightly later document that we have at Columbia, and it is quite large, almost 3 feet wide. And when I was about to do a treatment to flatten it, because it had been folded, I noticed this different colored area on the back, which had no other distinguishing features. So I looked under transmitted light, and this is how it appeared. So you can actually see the darker line where, just as Lalonde describes, the two edges overlap slightly. But what was incredible about this example is that even under magnification on the recto, on the front, you cannot see the joint. I've looked and looked, it's totally invisible. And I think it's this process of the very fresh skin being mended maybe with a scrap of the same animal that might have been available, then being surfaced, pounced, and just totally losing those edges. So it was really an astonishingly skillful one, but exactly, as described by Lalonde, also a way that a lot of us who've learned to treat parchment have learned to do it with scarfing the edges. So it's not totally surprising, but I'm really curious whether the adhesive, if we could test it, would match what he was saying about the gum. And then a little other detail about how certain surface phenomena may have been created. And Lalonde talks about the actions of the parchment maker when the skin is on the hearse and he's shaving it. He's holding it with two hands so that the blade's perpendicular to the hearse, and scraping at an angle, moving from top to bottom. And so here on this example, we're seeing angled striations going along here probably from a knife that wasn't perfectly true, probably had some serrations that were in it, and a lot of residual hair left behind there too. And then a really common feature that we might see often on 15th century Italian parchments used for bookbinding rather than for documents is a sort of poorly conditioned knife, where sometimes you see circular actions that are these serrations. And Diderot talks about the process of treating this knife, that it is given a burr, like if you've ever worked with a cabinet scraper, it's a sharp edge, and then you take a burnisher and turn the edge over so that there's a burr that sort of cuts, almost like a tooth, but it's microscopic. So this is the process that is described in the 18th century for preparing these blades. And Diderot gives or the Encyclopédie plates give the example of the burnisher and the different blade shapes. And with more detail, you can see that this isn't a deliberate practice, that something's gone wrong with this knife, that it's not even and it's making these strange striations. To compare that, back to our mazur that we were just looking at, there are a lot of areas all over the skin where there are very regular striations. And I'm going to highlight them in blue just so you can see the angle of what I'm talking about. If you look between those two blue lines, you'll see those striation marks. And this is highly magnified. So this is the knife cut of the sewing supports. So it's maybe like 2 or 3 millimeters. And Lalonde talks about, this is in relation to preparing parchment for artworks, that you might wet the surface before treating it for pastel, and that water will gelatinize the fibers of the parchment and beat down that kind of velvety surface that's needed for writing. And he describes that the parchment maker will fix this by working the skin in a manner similar to pouncing, but using a knife that's first been passed over a fine file, so that it creates small serrations in the edge. And then by cross-hatching, you can imagine how that would break up that gelatinized surface and return the opacity and velvety texture that you would be looking for. So finally, my last example of the evening, going to the question that everyone often is interested in, to look at the quality of the parchment of 13th century Bibles and marvel at how thin, and it's wonderful. We have different examples we can compare. It'll be proven what I'm saying, that these are actually the way I'm describing, that they're very translucent and thin and flexible. And it's amazing that you can have these small format Bibles with all the pages fitting in one volume. And so there have been speculations over the years. Is it squirrel? Is it rabbit? What kind of animal? And also discussions about splitting skins, that because sheepskin naturally splits, and you can have a sort of more like the epidermis or grain layer just prepared as parchment as well. So that would normally, you would expect to find a sheepskin. And I think a lot of confusion has been thrown around this topic by scholarship, first with a lot of cataloging, in past centuries, saying this is uterine vellum, it's from stillborn animals, and then a kind of reversal. So I'm going to put the famous quote by Daniel Thompson: "I should be inclined to think that animal husbandry must have been in a very precarious condition if enough calves were stillborn in the 13th century to provide all the pages which pass for uterine vellum." Very true. But I think this then has been taken sometimes as an indication that uterine vellum is simply a myth. It didn't really exist. And that's just not true. So we have Lalande's testimony. The most beautiful and prized vellum is made from a fetal calf when the butcher has killed a cow that was pregnant. These are called slinks. And it's not a happy topic to put in my paper, but it's a fact that, and it has been throughout time, that if you don't manage the herd properly at the time when you need to slaughter the animal, this may be its state. And so it did exist. It wasn't necessarily an indication that herd diseases were running rampant in the Middle Ages, but there would have been some source of this material. And the fact that Lalande in his treatise devotes a whole section to talking about the specific ways that you would prepare it different from other skins indicates that there was a robust process of turning it into parchment. And of course, we know people who are doing leather work today buy their raw materials on international markets from time to time, and you can find calf slink for sale. It is for sale, and I have a piece that was turned into parchment by Cowley's Parchment Works that was given to me years ago that we can look at too and compare it. But that's where I'd like to stop so that we can have some questions and answers, and I'll leave us with some nice images that maybe can help us consider the power of these treatises to accurately document the practices of an earlier period to which we now lack a direct connection. These aren't living trades anymore, but we're interested in these materials and how they were made. And if we can also be informed by close looking at historic examples, and in some cases scientific analysis or historic reconstruction, we can begin to use the treatises effectively to rediscover some of the lost treasures of human civilization that Reed and Lalande and even John talked about at the beginning of the talk. So thank you.
I'll start with a quick question, and then the floor is open. Yeah. Although it's actually about this image, that last one, but what happens in the 19th century? Do these places disappear? Do we have that many fewer testimonies from post-Enlightenment sources?
No, there are a lot in the 19th century. There are a lot of leather treatises, and as the 19th century goes on, you start to find that they reflect new materials, new chemistry coming into use, and a lot of them do retain a little section about parchment, and a lot of it is still Lalande talking about parchment, word for word in some cases. So
it's there, but it's not necessarily reliable in a way.
Yeah, and in a way, that's a good question, because I think maybe the treatises or texts that we see then kind of reflect the place of parchment in the leather workers kit, that it's a specialty thing that's a bit archaic, that's still done, and that's kind of how it is today, even. Yeah, exactly.
Great. That.
Thank you. That was really great. For a project I was doing, I was working with a lot of paper books that had been patched and repaired in the 19th century, and was reading actually a French treatise about this, and it's very, very similar to the way you describe the patching with parchment. The thinning of the edges of both the patch and the paper you want to patch, and then the overlaying, and you do it wet, and then you beat it and dry it. I mean, it's very similar, and it occurs. So I hadn't thought about that connection, but I had these are amazing repairs too. Yeah. And I thought, well, where did they get, how did they do this or think to do this? And so do you think that this is trade knowledge that's being learned by they're mainly book binders from parchment makers as late as the 1830s?
Oh.
Or a kind of knowledge that's been passed somehow?
I think it's definitely knowledge that's been passed along. I would think it's probably more, in the restorer's path, because these are also repairs that are happening later to things that were already made and used and collected. So I think it would be restorer's secret that they're sharing with the few people that are their students or that they're training, looking at other people. I mean, Sarah and Tessa can tell you, a lot of these practices aren't exactly the way that we would do them today. Like, I remember every lab that I started at the beginning of my career had the box of old end leaves that got pulled out of other books because it was blank paper, and you could do beautiful repairs with it if you wanted, and that's what everyone wanted to do.
Well, that's what these bookbinders have. They had a hospital, they call it a hospital of paper from early books that they had pulled out of the books.
Right.
So that probably is continuous.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can match chain lines, lay lines, and so I think it's, partly it probably just grows out of like so many craft practices do, or technical skills, that the materials in some ways guide you more. That's another teacher, and so people could simultaneously be developing the same practices because they make sense. But I think that a lot of this was just passed from master to student. So it sounds like a great project, though. I'd love to see those repairs. Have you looked under transmitted light?
Yeah, it's exactly like that. That's exactly, now with the ones I was looking at on paper, I think they have discolored over time, so the seam is sometimes more visible than I think it would have been in the 19th century.
Exactly.
But sometimes it's very good and you can't see it under.
Especially if, some at earlier dates, people would add things to their paste to keep it fresh longer. Alum, all kinds of things that will turn brown too.
Thank you so much. We have an amazing example in a 12th century manuscript we have that we do bring up, of repairs that, to my mind, are original. I mean, there's text, there's 12th century, the manuscript of Ivo Sharp, and it has text that goes across repairs across sort of putty that seems to sort of level repair. I'd love to maybe find a photo and show you, but
that would be
in my mind, I mean, I've looked at a lot of damaged manuscripts with different kinds of repair, but this is really exceptional that this sort of whatever compound was used has survived and has writing across it. That's absolutely contemporary with the manuscript. And I wonder if you encountered this, or if you have any idea of what this kind of, I mean, I say putty, but it's just some sort of compound that levels the patch, from the front side.
It would be really interesting to look, and I'm sure your conservation department will have some ideas about how to test that. I'm just going to share this again because I also was going to show you, there were a couple of things that I didn't have time, so I pulled out a lot of slides. There it is. So another technique that Lalonde talks about, he calls it cannetin, which is the membrane or the epidermis. And so by taking that epidermis off, you can make this patch here, you put it over the hole, and you can see on the other side that the writing is going across it. And if yours looked like putty, it could also be that they were pouncing it with a lot of chalk that kind of made it like a ground to write on as well. So it would be really interesting. Looking under the microscope would be the way to do that. Yeah. But I don't know. I wonder if it's something like that. Can you see on both sides? I think you can, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. I'll try to find it. I mean,
Yeah.
it does show up in the digital images we have of it, so I will look that up.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yes, sir.
Just to add on to that, I mean, can you talk about some of the examinations, other visual examinations that scholars use, and then maybe how that compares to what conservators have?
Oh, yeah, great question. That's great. Yeah, we're just doing this with, we started a graduate course at Columbia this semester, Intro to Medieval Manuscript Studies. And it's a team taught course that the curators and faculty and I are teaching, so we're doing exactly that. But looking with raking light at a low angle. And this was really revealing for some of the students who are trying to look at ruling. And until, drawing the ruled lines within size marking, and until we brought the light way down low, it was very hard to see, but suddenly it popped out. You could see which side it had been applied on, see all about it. So that's one great technique. Ultraviolet light is another one. And all of these, like every reading room is going to have different practices, whether you're allowed to do it in the reading room. At Columbia, we are a little bit more hands-off, and so we ask for the images that the scholars are interested in, and we'll take the UV images at very high resolution. That's something we're starting to develop, UV or IR imaging, or have consultations where we'll look with scholars so that we can really focus and help them answer their questions. And we've been a little concerned to have lights in the reading room because what I tell the students in our class is that I'm a conservator, but when I want to look at something from my research, I realize that I start handling it in a really different way. And when we've done studies together, if I'm a conservator and I'm doing the sampling, we have kind of a spotter who's not the conservator, who helps make sure that everything's being done according to plan. So those are some of the ones that we look at, and different materials are going to be revealed differently. So going to your example of the putty substance, if it's something like chalk, it'll react differently under UV. It might fluoresce, and that'll give you some indication without having to do anything else at all. You get a lot of information.
So let me put the Paris Bible question back on the table since you brought it up.
Okay,
You
yeah.
teased us with this, and just ask about the quantity. I mean, part of this Paris Bible debate, if I'm right, is about quantity. So, okay, you sort of took us on a middle position about the uterine
Yeah.
question, but one thing we know about Paris Bibles is the spectacular number of so-called Paris Bibles of this small one volume size, whether they were produced in Paris or not, is the massive quantity of production of those Bibles, right? So much so that even in the era of print, they're still around. The Hamill and other people have written about it. Okay, so how do you get so much of that kind of parchment?
Right. That's a really good question. Again, it might help to just look at the slide. Now, this is not my research. I've been very fascinated by this research. I know you're conservatives, I know this too. But oops, sorry. I didn't do that. I just lost my screen share. Or did I? Am I sharing?
Sorry. But unshare and reshare.
Okay. Sorry. But it really will help if we can look at this image. So, yeah. Oh well. Yeah, I'm not sure why that one went, but maybe I closed the presentation now. But there's been a project over maybe almost 10 years to, so if you do DNA analysis, everyone's heard of DNA, and usually quite a large sample size is needed compared to the scale of a manuscript. And of course, if we care about these really precious, delicate, dainty little materials, to cut out 5 millimeter square divots, it might give us useful and interesting information, but we're not likely to do it. So thank you so much for the discussion. So this great great innovation has come out of recent research where instead of DNA, which tells you familial relationships as well as species, like if you want to know leaf 5 is the mother of leaf 100, DNA might tell you, and it isn't always destroyed by the parchment making process, so you can get DNA information. But this process is instead to do peptide sequencing, so it's about protein, and some people may have done this or know about it. And so this was their results from a 2015 study. Have you all done it, Sarah, in your lab? Yeah, we're looking at maybe doing that too. And what did you get good results?
We just had a very small number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it varies, right? If you take from the part of the leaf that people handle, you may get human epithelial cells as your result. But they were able to test enough of these, and I can send the reference around if people want. But so they have this great color-coded key for the species. So when they looked at different centuries, they were getting a range. Of course, these are all animals that are part of diet, so cows, sheep, and goats. And they could look, and of course, like we all know, there are more goats used for parchment in Italy. But it was interesting to see that they were only finding that after the 13th century, and more calves and sheep in England. But when they compared 13th century France for regular books, all manuscripts, and then the pocket Bibles or Paris Bible, they weren't finding sheep, which is really interesting because those are the animals you would expect would be split and would easily lend themselves to this process. So they're continuing their research, and I think they were leaning toward thinking there must have been a very sophisticated way that parchment makers had to deeply thin down the thickness of the skin so that they could have very flexible leaves that you could pack a lot of in a book, but they're mainly coming from calves. The question of whether these could all be stillborn calves, it seems extraordinary. I think if you could find, calf skin normally has vein patterns, and the size of the veins in parchment, if you look at my stillborn parchment, the veins are like spider webs. They're so thin. And so if you could find evidence of veins residual in the skins, that would help to answer that question. But it's very hard to find that kind of evidence because they're so thin. That's the only thing that I could think of, because not much else would tell you the age of the animal when it was turned into parchment.
Yeah.
We have a question from the chat. Did your research leave you with some new questions, either that you'd like to dig into or that you hope others will?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. Like any good project, it left me with lots more questions, which is why I'm still doing it. And I'm just interested right now in being able to complete. Some people have been working on a great translation of Lalande that I'm interested in, the Chamoiseau and Mégissier, the related trade, and adding annotations or some of the other information that we can bring to bear if we understand the materials. Talking to scholars, I think that would be a really fascinating project. The question of uterine vellum and around the slump skins is really interesting, but I think it is one that probably scientific analysis is going to give us a lot more than just archival studies. This is amazing. Thank you for that question.
So the question over there? Yeah. Well, with apologies to the Zoomers, I bet you people want to have you take us on a tour of what's on this table here. So yeah, we'll do our best to bring that remote camera over for sure. Anything else in Zoom there, Island? Okay, so let's thank Alexis, but let's make her hit a little by showing us what I guess it's a combination of me shopping and her setting up and picking from what. And I should have gotten Evo, and I feel badly about that, but there's always more parts. So let's walk over there and see what we have to see.
Does anyone